Life hack, a gun-free America in 5 easy steps. For a gun-free America, the first thing you'll need is 2/3 of Congress, so elect a minimum of 67 senators and 290 representatives who are on your side. Then have them vote to propose an amendment to the Constitution which repeals Second Amendment gun rights for all Americans. Then convince the legislators of 38 states to ratify that amendment. Congratulations! The Second Amendment is now history. At this point, you've done absolutely nothing to decrease gun violence. All you've done is remove the barrier for Congress to legally act. You need to enact common sense gun reform. You can try to do what Australia did and, ban all guns? That's not at all what they did, but whatever, go big or go home, right? Get that law passed by Congress and signed by the President. Great! The law is passed and guns are now illegal. The only thing left to do is enforce the law. Guns don't just disappear because you passed a law. You need to confiscate over 350 million guns scattered among over 330 million Americans. Sure, you can try a buyback program like Australia, but like Australia, that will still leave behind anywhere from 60 to 80% of privately owned firearms. The rest of them, you have to take. You'll need the police, the FBI, the ATF, the National Guard, all known for their nuanced approach to potentially dangerous situations, to go door to door through 3.8 million square miles of this country and take them by force from thousands, if not millions, of well-armed individuals, many of whom would rather start a civil war than acquiesce. So inevitably, gun violence, which is currently at a historic low, will skyrocket. But that is how you get a gun-free America in 5 easy steps.
I'm not going to banter back and forth with you. Thank you. Thank you. You had your time. You may sit down.
That mayor was unhappy with me because I just asked if he and his fellow politicians were on the take. I asked because they want to seize a valuable piece of land. Check out this view. Wouldn't you like to have an apartment with this view of the New York City skyline? It's a rare, gorgeous location right on the Hudson River. Right now, there's nothing here but dirt. So this man, who works for the developer Maxell Group, wants to build apartments like these. Thousands of people could live here with this great view.
And this whole pier would be open to the public.
They'd also build a facility for ferries, so people on this side of the river could commute to Manhattan on ferries like that one.
Ferry would come right in here and go from here straight to Midtown Manhattan.
Sounds good to me. But then the politicians in this town said, no, forget about it. We're going to seize the property and spend millions of taxpayer dollars to put our Department of Public Works here. This little department, it has just 13 employees, plus these trucks. The garbage trucks will like this.
This is a great, you're absolutely right.
The city does say we'll also put in a park and parking, but at taxpayer expense. Maxell offered parking and parks at no cost.
Parks, we were offering mass transit, and all at no cost to taxpayers.
Plus, the town would collect an additional $12 million in taxes every year. Why would Edgewater say no to that?
The unsuccessful bidder is a fellow named Fred Davies, told us, you will never be able to develop this property.
Fred Davies says he's the biggest apartment developer in town. He also says you can't be in Edgewater and not be affiliated with me. Davies also controls this New Jersey bank. And I wonder if he controls the politicians in town, too. Because the lawsuit filed by Maxell alleges corrupt transactions between Davies and Edgewater's politicians.
Ongoing relationships with them, jobs, undervalued rentals, loans for their business purposes through a bank that Mr. Davies started and has the controlling interest in.
Sounds like Mr. Davies controls the town.
That seems, unfortunately, self-evident.
Edgewater Mayor Michael McPartland's connected to Davies. The mayor lives in this building. It's quite elegant with statues and fountains. And it happens to be owned by Fred Davies. According to the lawsuit, the mayor pays below market rent. though the mayor told the New York Times he doesn't pay below market rent. The mayor and city council say they have a good reason for using eminent domain and taxpayer money to seize Maxwell's development. They say Maxwell's project was just too much. The developer's proposal is too big, says the mayor.
They just approved a larger project with a more intense density, and guess for whom?
For Fred Davies. Work is already going on his site because somehow Davies
got approvals for a density of and population of people that would occupy it in excess of what we were seeking.
250 more apartments, 4 giant buildings, twice as tall as Maxwell's proposal. We tried to ask Fred Davies about all this, but he didn't respond to our calls and emails. How can the town justify approving dense development for Davies while rejecting a smaller proposal from a competitor? I tried to ask Edgewater's mayor and the city council about this, but not one would agree to talk. So I came here to a city council meeting, and I asked,
Are you on the take?
I should explain why I'm asking that in a largely empty room. The council session was full earlier, but questions from people like me weren't allowed until most everyone had left.
Are you on the take? Because you're rejecting one building in favor of the one owned by the guy where you live.
Mr. Mayor, as your legal counsel, I'm going to suggest and recommend that you don't answer the questions of this gentleman right here.
Understood.
And I'm certainly not with that tone and the objectionable tone.
We just set the rules.
Do you want to say?
If you want to ask us questions that are pertaining to the town or anything that's going on here, you're more than welcome to use your 5 minutes to do that.
So I tried.
The big developer in town said, more or less, nobody develops here but me, and that's the way it's turned out. And you're going to put the Department of Public Works there instead?
Are you done with your?
You done? You got a few.
Well, I asked questions.
Well, like I said, we answer it when you're finished, and when we close the meeting, when you're finished with your comments.
At this point, I thought I might actually get my questions answered.
Is it true that 4 of you are getting loans from Mr. Davies' bank? And is it true that you get a discounted apartment in Mr. Davies' building?
Again, Mr. Mayor, I don't think it's appropriate.
But no answer.
Are you finished? Are you finished?
He's done.
That's fine. He's done? Very good. Is there anyone else in the public that wishes to be heard? Anyone? Close the meeting to the public.
Should I stick around and someone will talk to me or not?
You're welcome to stick around.
You're welcome to stick around. It's fine to be. But I'm not going to banter back and forth with you. Thank you. Thank you. You've had your time. You may sit down.
And that was that. Maxwell's lawsuit claims the mayor and the council have engaged in corrupt transactions to favor Fred Davies.
So he's killing off competition. It's as simple as that.
A great thing about capitalism is that the way to get rich is to serve your customers well. Developers can't really be thugs. They can't use force. They can't tell other developers you can't build here unless they have cronies in government. And that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism. Actually, it's corruption. To me, that sure seems to be what's going on here. These days, all Americans are told, go to college.
A higher education is the single best investment.
But a new book, The Case Against Education, says this college push is a big mistake.
How many thousands of hours did you spend in classes studying subjects that you never thought about again?
Economist Brian Kaplan says most people who go to college shouldn't. I learned little in college. I like my friends and illegal drinking, but I slept through lectures. At least tuition then was $2,000. Now it's almost $50,000.
People usually just want to talk about the tuition, which is a big deal. But there's also all the years that people spend in school when they could have been doing something else. If you just take a look at the faces of the students, it's obvious that they're bored. And people are there primarily in order to get a good job.
Because a diploma is a signaling device for people with
no more brains than you have, but they have one thing you haven't got, a diploma.
The con man, who was the Wizard of Oz, hinted at the problem years ago.
Doctor of Thinkology.
Why'd you write this book? The Wizard of Oz already made the argument.
But almost no one seems to believe it.
College graduation has never been more valuable than it is today.
Education is my top priority, and by supporting this budget, you'll make it yours as well.
Meaning taxpayers must pay for it. All the politicians say, go to college. And there is evidence. The higher you go, the more money you make.
It's totally true that when people go and get more and better and fancier degrees, that their income generally goes up. But the reason why this is happening is not really that college is pouring tons of job skills into you. The reason is that it's impressive.
You aren't saying you, individual, don't go to college. You're saying we as a country are suckers to push it and subsidize it.
Exactly. Just because it is lucrative for an individual doesn't mean that it's a good idea for a country.
Because when most everyone goes to college, that just raises the bar.
Imagine that you're at a concert, everyone is sitting down, and you want to see better. What can you do? Well, you can stand up. All right, and of course, then you'll see better. Now, it does not follow, though, that if everyone stands up, everyone sees better.
You just block each other's views. The same thing has happened in education, says Kaplan. As more people got degrees, more employers insisted on degrees. The result isn't that graduates get better jobs. It's that employers require degrees for most every job.
There are so many jobs where it used to be crazy to think that you would need a college degree, like to be a waiter in a fancy restaurant, where now it would be very normal.
Of course, a college education's about more than getting a job. It's also about learning. But Kaplan says if students really wanted to learn, they would just do it.
If you want to go to Princeton, you don't have to apply. Just move to the town and start attending classes.
Nobody does that.
In people's bones, they realize that what really counts is that diploma.
Today, that's a taxpayer-subsidized diploma. And when you subsidize something, you get more of it. More students apply to college, so schools raise tuition. Tuition cost has risen at triple the rate of inflation. Schools use that money to attract more students and more tax money. Many compete by advertising luxury. They promote things like lobster dinners, fancy pools.
Students will come to us and say, this is what sealed the deal. It used to be reading, writing, and arithmetic. And well, we're now the fourth R, recreation.
600 colleges now have rock walls.
Give our Tigers spring break every time they step in to the student recreation complex.
This is a public school. Taxpayers fund that spring break. We also fund years of study in subjects unlikely to help students get jobs, like social justice, gender studies, multicultural studies.
So if you're doing computer science or electrical engineering, then you probably are actually learning a bunch of useful skills. But every year we graduate about twice as many psychology bachelor's degrees as we do engineering bachelor's degrees.
Of course, there's value in learning psychology, philosophy, literature. Many employers say they want liberal arts graduates.
It's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the result that makes our hearts sing.
It makes us better, wiser people.
But you can't assume that works. How many years of people's lives should they be made to study stuff when the odds that they'll ever appreciate it are 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000?
Maybe it makes our brains work better.
That's the kind of thing that you'd expect teachers to say, but there's a whole field of people who have actually studied this. Much as they want to believe that you're right, they generally come away after looking at a lot of evidence and saying, wow, actually, it's wishful thinking.
Although Kaplan calls college a scam, he says it's great for a few people. People like him.
I'm a tenured professor. Your audience may not realize how good of a gig this is, but a tenured professor cannot be fired for almost any reason. And you get a nice income, and there are almost no demands upon your time.
You just have to teach 5 hours a week.
Well, there's people who consider that a horrible burden.
That's a scam that we're paying so much money for people like you to teach 5 hours.
Yeah, well, I'm a whistleblower.
The bottom line of the case against education?
Taxpayers ought to know that they're getting ripped off. Government has made a tremendous effort to make education accessible to everyone. And I say really what we need to do is to go back to a world where college is not so accessible, where it really distinguishes you. And in this way, people are going to be able to start their lives years earlier. The wisest solution, all things considered, would be if government just got out.
It would be good if government got out of a lot of things. Do you watch CSI, Law and Order, NCIS? I like how those crime shows use modern science to get the bad guy.
Grab's prints are all over Singer's convertible. The pollen that was in Petty Officer Bick's lungs is found only one place on Earth.
People who watch these shows believe that this is how it's really done.
It's not?
It's not.
Former Detective Harry Houck's annoyed that the TV shows make forensic science look infallible.
And you watch a detective get down and look at a body and touch it. Yeah, he's been dead for 3 hours now. He ate dinner 4 hours ago. I can't do that.
On TV, experts identify the killer by his bite mark.
A little 3D magic for clarity, and I give you the killer's incisors.
In real life, experts claim they can identify criminals that way.
Swinton was convicted and sentenced to 60 years in prison based on testimony that bite marks found on the victim were his.
The TV show Cold Case Files covered the trial in which Alfred Swinton was convicted because this so-called bite mark expert said Swinton's teeth matched a bite on the victim.
When the models of the teeth were laid onto the bite mark, it was a perfect match.
The expert explained he's a neutral scientist.
A forensic scientist is not on the side of the prosecution or the defense. We look at the evidence and we make sure that if we're going to make a decision, it's going to be a truthful decision.
The doctor was just wrong. He was just wrong because it's an unreliable technique.
It looks like science.
It does. They're in white lab coats. They sound very authoritative, but they're full of it.
Lawyer Chris Fabricant helped get Swinton freed from jail by doing a DNA test.
New DNA evidence shows he had nothing to do with the 1991 murder of Carla Terry.
Tonight, Alfred Swinton's conviction was vacated, and he's a free man.
That's Chris Fabricant celebrating with Swinton the day he was released.
Bite marks is similar to you and I maybe looking at a cloud, and then I say to you, John, doesn't that cloud look like a rabbit to you? And then you look at it and say, yeah, Chris, I think that does look like a rabbit.
But that kind of junk science puts innocent people in jail. That's 1 or 2 people. Many more people are in jail, and we're supposedly safer because of that.
If you think that maybe even 1% of convicted defendants may have been innocent, we have 2.6 million people in prison today. So we're not talking about a couple of people. We're talking about tens of thousands of people.
But the people who use these techniques, they believe in it. They're confident.
Sure, they're confident. It's faith-based science.
The expert who got Swinton convicted now admits he was wrong. But police still trust bite marks.
Let's say one tooth is missing in the front. So you got to look at that, and your suspect's got one tooth missing in the front. That's pretty good. But then again, that's not enough.
Houck says he'd demand other evidence, but not all cops do, especially if experts say they're sure someone's guilty. When they say so, you trust that.
Yes.
But even fingerprint evidence isn't foolproof.
The deadliest terror attack on Europe since World War II.
When terrorists in Madrid killed 193 people, the FBI found this fingerprint on one of the terrorists' bags and matched it to this fingerprint of a man in Oregon.
An international investigation led to Brandon Mayfield.
However,
2 weeks after Mayfield's arrest, Spanish investigators found the man to whom the fingerprint really belonged.
FBI researchers claim fingerprints are right more than 99% of the time, but that still leaves plenty of wrongful convictions. Other techniques are even less accurate. Carpet fiber evidence, gun tracing, hair matching.
Microscopic hair comparison evidence has been admitted by courts for a century.
In one case, it was a dog's hair.
A dog hair was associated wrongfully with the human hair. Since the turn of this century, there have been 75 wrongful convictions.
Fabricant works for the Innocence Project. By using more modern DNA evidence, the project's lawyers have helped free 191 innocent people. All these people were wrongly jailed based on so-called scientific evidence. Why do judges admit this stuff? Why don't defense attorneys get it thrown out?
We all went to law school because we don't know science. We don't know math. And if somebody comes in with a white lab coat and says, I've been accredited by the American Board of Forensic Odontology and I've been practicing for 20 years, that's good enough for government work.
That shouldn't be the standard. Too much is at stake. Jurors tend to believe people who courts call experts. But the experts often rely on junk science. Juries and judges should be much more skeptical.
Dr. Forrest Tennant is one of the last doctors in America willing to treat pain patients using high doses of opioid painkillers.
I want you to take those two, and then I want you to take an oxytocin if we need to. Okay?
He operates out of a strip mall in West Covina, California, and he's contacted by patients from all over the country on a daily basis, pleading with him to treat them because nobody else will.
Physicians would get these patients dependent, high dosage, couldn't manage them, and then they would send them to me. And all that's happened in my clinic is an escalation of people desiring treatment for the last 10 years, up to where now we literally shut our phones off because they're filled by 9 o'clock in the morning.
But he may be closing his clinic's doors, which have been open since 1975, in a matter of months. When Reason did a story on Tennant's clinic in 2017, his patients spoke of how government restrictions on opioid use were causing legitimate pain patients to suffer needlessly.
Doctors have been closing their doors to chronic pain patients.
We're tired of the battle.
Many of us around the country have doctors who are being persecuted, and some are literally being prosecuted.
4 months after we ran that story, the DEA raided Tennant's clinic and home. The search warrant accused him of overprescribing medication and accepting payoffs from the pharmaceutical company Insys. Tennant has earned speaking fees from the company as recently as 2015, which he says is standard practice. And his nonprofit clinic regularly operates at a loss according to financial statements submitted to the Department of Justice.
I'd like to tell you it makes some money. Some years it doesn't make anything. In fact, we lose.
I really believe he saved my son's life. When the DEA raided Dr. Tennant's clinic, I was really saddened because I felt that Dr. Tennant always did things the right way, and I couldn't understand why they were going after such a renowned pain doctor.
What was my reaction when Dr. Tennant's clinic was raided? I think the government's trying to kill me and every one of his patients. That we have no place to run.
The opioid
epidemic with a lawsuit aimed against 5 major drug companies.
4 out of every 5 new heroin addicts in the country today started on prescription opioids.
Doctors that are prescribing incredibly high numbers.
If we catch a drug dealer, death penalty. That's it.
Politicians and journalists often tell a story about greedy pharmaceutical companies that turn doctors into dealers and patients into addicts. And now we're told tens of thousands of Americans are dying of overdoses every year because of government inaction. But if this is truly an epidemic, it appears the diagnosis is wrong in a few major ways, and the cure prescribed by the government is making the disease worse.
When you restrict access to these drugs because you think some people might get addicted to them, that hurts lots of innocent people.
For 21 years, journalist Jacob Sullum has been writing about the suffering caused by restricting access to pain medication. And his April cover feature for Reason magazine examines the myths underlying the government's response to the opioid overdose problem.
Pain clinics are swamped by these patients who used to be treated by other doctors. Some of these people can't find treatment. Some of them are killing themselves.
People are starting to commit suicide at very high numbers. We know that people are going into withdrawal. We know that people are having heart attacks. We know that people are going out taking anything they can get their hands on and overdosing.
One thing they worry about is trouble with the Drug Enforcement Administration, which may end up investigating them because they look suspicious. Why do they look suspicious? Because they're treating lots of people in pain. People who may have been treated by other doctors and end up coming to the one doctor in the area who's still willing to treat them. And even if he does everything by the book, even if he's very careful, he does thorough examinations, he has their records, just the numbers that he's generating, and that will look suspicious to the DEA. All of this rhetoric that you hear from politicians and from the press saying We have an opioid epidemic in America because of careless doctors.
We're identifying a lot of ill-mill doctors that are prescribing incredibly high numbers.
It's not starting on our street corners, it's starting in our doctors' offices and hospitals.
Most of the policymakers have bought into this idea that we doctors prescribe an opioid for our patients, who then rapidly become drug addicts, when all of the evidence suggests that this is not the case.
Jeffrey Singer is a physician and policy analyst based in Phoenix, Arizona. He has donated to Reason Foundation, the nonprofit that publishes ReasonTV.
Study after study, including a recent study in January from researchers at Harvard and Johns Hopkins, have shown that patients given opioids for appropriate reasons have a less than 1% addiction rate. In the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, we doctors were way too stingy, and we were making patients suffer needlessly. I can remember countless times when I visit my post-surgical patients and I'd see them in obvious pain, and I'd say, have you taken the morphine that I ordered for you because you look like you're in pain? And they say, no, I don't want to get addicted. So we had this what's called opiophobia on both sides of the bed. But as we started prescribing it more opioids became in circulation.
Singer says it's a myth that most non-medical users start on pills prescribed by a doctor.
The source of these drugs is often the home medicine cabinet.
Studies show that many abused prescription drugs are obtained from family and friends, including from the home medicine cabinet.
The overwhelming majority of non-medical opioid users never go to a doctor or never had a medical encounter that introduced them to that.
Diversion is the primary route of opioids to non-medical users, which is why take-back programs exist. But the persistent belief that doctors are regularly turning patients into opioid addicts has motivated agencies like the CDC to set maximum prescription dosage guidelines, which were supposed to be voluntary.
I do not know of physicians who are going to be willing to prescribe high-dose opioids anymore.
I'm not too sure what Dr. Tennant is doing with me today, but I'm here because I don't want to die.
Gary Snook began seeing Dr. Tennant more than 10 years ago when his Montana-based doctors failed to relieve his chronic pain resulting from back surgery complications. Because almost no other doctor is willing to take Tennant's rare, high-risk patients at their current dosage levels, Tennant has decided to spend his final few months attempting to taper his patients down below the CDC guideline levels.
Whatever he's doing, I have to successfully go through it, so I can hopefully have a doctor on the other end that will treat me.
There are people who need those high dosages. They have a genetic pattern. I've done some recent genetic tests that show some terrible genetic variations, and I don't know how those people are ever going to get down to 90. There has been propaganda, and it's pure propaganda, that you can just stop opioids. You don't need to taper them, just stop. We're going to have some patients commit suicide. We're going to have patients that are going to have heart attacks.
Doctors in Montana don't take people like me. I don't have a doctor now. And there's no way that I'm going to be able to keep living without compassionate care.
Cigna and now Florida Blue.
This week, the maker of
the
OxyContin announced it is ending its marketing operation for the powerful opioid.
It comes as 13 states sue Purdue for deceptive marketing.
OxyContin hit the U.S. market in 1995 and promptly became the pill of choice for non-medical street users of opioids. Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin, was aware of its popularity as a street drug, a fact it allegedly worked to conceal. Yet the company also created abuse-resistant formulations which are uncrushable and can't be liquefied. By doing so, they were able to extend the drug's patent. With encouragement from the Food and Drug Administration, the company soon made all its OxyContin pills uncrushable. Singer says policies of this sort have profound unintended consequences.
The only thing they have done is just made non-medical users switch over to something other than opioids. And most of the time it's been heroin. This concept of abuse-deterrent formulations is not brand new. During the days of alcohol prohibition, ethanol was still allowed to be manufactured for commercial use. It was used in medications, for certain paints, for a lot of different preparations. And ethanol got diverted into the black market by bootleggers. So the government initially ordered that the ethanol used for commercial purposes be what they call denatured with certain ingredients that would make it unpalatable.
But it's hard to stop determined consumers from getting what they want. People kept drinking the denatured alcohol, so the government went a step further.
They actually ordered poisons added to it. We know of at least 10,000 documented deaths from poisoning from people who drank ethanol. And Darkley, the director for the U.S. Treasury of that program, he said, if some people die in order to have a more sober, alcohol-free society, then it's the price worth paying. I don't think for a minute that any of our policymakers today have that kind of attitude. But if they step back and think of what they're doing by promoting abuse-deterrent formulations of opioids, they're in effect doing the same thing that the alcohol prohibition people did. They're driving people to much more dangerous, deadly substances.
Despite the government's efforts, consumers continue to drink denatured alcohol, often at the cost of their own lives. Likewise, opioid users have continued to consume their drug of choice despite the government's crackdown on pain pills.
But this is the way prohibition works. Prohibition makes drug use more dangerous to the extent that the government actually has succeeded in making pain pills harder to obtain. It has pushed people into a black market where the risks are much higher. The focus on prescription painkillers is especially misguided now that the vast majority of opioid-related deaths actually involve illegally produced drugs.
My name is Jillian Monda. I'm from Cleveland. I'm 28 years old, and I used to be a drug addict, but now I'm not. 2013 was a kind of rough year for me. I was sexually assaulted on my birthday. I kind of got a little bit too into just trying to escape that idea in the first place. Roughly 4 months after I was assaulted, I met my now ex. It started with us just doing acid all the time and talking about life, and then one night it was, hey, do you want to try this thing? It's fun. It's not anything like anybody tells you it is. And I believed him, so I tried it. I hated it the first time because I didn't like nodding and feeling like I was going to die. But the second time I tried it, I really liked it, and it kind of became a weird escape for me, and I feel like I never stopped after that.
Heroin, like OxyContin, is an opioid. Sullum says that victims of trauma like Monda or people with mental illnesses who are self-medicating are far more likely to develop an opioid addiction than are pain patients, who only develop addiction about 1% of the time.
It's appealing to think that you can solve the problem of opioid-related deaths by focusing on the supply of opioids. If you're interested in reducing addiction and the problems related to addiction, you have to talk about what are those factors that make this appealing. Why does somebody want to use heroin all day long?
Heroin is really good at making you not feel anything at all. It's not necessarily that you're just feeling really fucked up or really entertainingly intoxicated. It's really just that if you had any emotions about anything, things you normally care about, the longer you're on it, you just don't care anymore. I've always kind of had anxiety issues, and I found out that I had obsessive compulsive disorder. So getting sexually assaulted, I feel like it was extra hard when you have your entire mental health is dependent on feeling like you're in 100% control all the time and someone else takes that control away from you. So instead of dealing with that in therapy like a healthy adult would have done, I just kind of shoved it down and pretended it didn't happen and it wasn't that big of a deal. The one thing I've realized just between the people that I was hanging out with, people that I met in rehab, the big unifying factor was that everybody kind of had some kind of mental problem or thing they were trying to avoid or an issue that was kind of plaguing them, and rather than getting proper psychiatric care for that, they were just doing heroin.
Between 2002 and 2013, the number of heroin overdose deaths nearly quadrupled.
And they think it's being caused by a dealer or dealers who are lacing the drug with an elephant tranquilizer.
The frightening rates of overdoses are fueled by a mix of heroin and an opioid called fentanyl.
Not only has the number of heroin-related deaths gone up dramatically since 2010, but that increase is much more dramatic than the increase in heroin users. So this suggests that heroin is getting much more dangerous. And the most obvious explanation for that is that heroin is increasingly mixed with fentanyl.
In the beginning, it started with just hot pockets of fentanyl, like it was just little bits that were in your wrap, and sometimes you would get just an entire shot of fentanyl, which when the rest of your batch isn't fentanyl, your body wasn't expecting it or is used to it, so it made it really easy to overdose. But gradually it just sort of shifted into, you couldn't even really get morphine-based heroin anymore. It was just, everything was all fentanyl. It was all weird colors. There was pink stuff, there was purple stuff. It was just a really strange transition into everything being entirely fentanyl, and then how much stronger could they make the fentanyl?
This is what you see when you prohibit drugs. Drug traffickers will gravitate toward more potent forms of the drug. Black market drugs were always more dangerous than legally produced ones, in the same way that black market alcohol was more dangerous than legally produced alcohol during alcohol prohibition. If you ask, how can we reduce opioid-related deaths? There are several strategies that are very promising. They do not rely on eliminating the supply, because that has proven to be fruitless and counterproductive for over, a century now.
Cities like San Francisco and Oakland, California are at the forefront of what's called the harm reduction movement.
Harm reduction is at its core a pragmatic sort of way of looking at all risk-taking behavior. Access to opioid agonist treatment like buprenorphine and methadone. Access to interventions that are going to reduce harm from injection, like safer injection facilities, syringe exchange.
James Formo runs a syringe access program in San Francisco, which allows heroin users to turn in dirty needles and get clean ones in return.
We're meeting people where they're at, and we're arming them with information and tools to make better decisions to stay safe. We're also helping people stay alive long enough to make the choice to either go into treatment or stop using altogether. You know, it breaks my heart to hear someone say, oh, they should just die. Like, it'd be better off if they were dead, because there would be one less drug addict on the street.
And now San Francisco's Department of Public Health is preparing to convert some needle exchanges into safe consumption sites, where drug users can shoot up, snort, or smoke their drugs under supervision. San Francisco would be the first American city to allow safe injection sites, but Vancouver has already allowed the practice for years, and the U.S. Surgeon General recently announced support for the idea in America.
Studies of Insight, the supervised injection facility in Vancouver, and they all find there are positive health effects, reduction in overdoses. People worried that there would be an increase in crime in the neighborhood. That didn't happen either. There are good data indicating that supervised injection facilities save lives.
This is one of those instances, like almost all harm reduction interventions, where the problem with implementation is not lack of evidence that it works. What we are battling is a moral discomfort.
And there's an even more radical approach than that of harm reduction. In response to its own overdose crisis, Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001.
They have a rate of roughly 6 overdose deaths per million population, as opposed to the United States that has roughly 312 overdose deaths per million population. When you end prohibition, you make it easier for people to come forth without fear, who want help, who want to get help with their habit or their addiction. And you also stop driving people towards dangerous drugs.
The DEA investigation of Dr. Tennant is ongoing. He's hoping to find another doctor to take over his clinic. If not, he'll close its doors by the end of June, and his patients, already turned away by their hometown doctors, will need to find someone else to care for them.
You can't just take somebody off opioid drugs and throw them to the street. When people get hopeless is when they think about suicide. And so I think we need to give everybody some hope. If nothing else, let them know somebody cares.
If you look at the practical effects of cracking down on opioids, the strategy the government seems to be pursuing, based on the results, is what you might call harm maximization. If it continues to do that to the exclusion of harm reduction policies, you're not going to see a decrease in opioid-related deaths, and in fact, they may continue to go up.